And so this morning, we transition to an area that we have not explored at all in the conference thus far. So I am happy to introduce our newest colleague to Duke University, Dr. Lauren Brinkley-Rubinstein, who is coming from UNC Chapel Hill to be a part of population health sciences on the medical side, and she's going to be working with the Cook Center on our efforts in criminal justice and mass incarceration. So, Dr. Lauren Brinkley-Rubinstein brings some data, primary data, that looks at COVID and the prison population. So we're really excited about having her here, and she will introduce her team and share more about the findings from her research. So Dr. Lauren Brinkley-Rubinstein.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Okay, everybody can hear me? Okay, great, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. I got a little faked out by this mic, but I'm using this mic, so I'm gonna walk away. I'm Lauren, this is my team, and this is Forrest here, and Dr. Craig Waleed. And we are a part of a team that looks at mass incarceration's impact on health broadly. We're gonna talk today about COVID, about mass incarceration, hyper-incarceration, and why incarceration and people who are incarcerated were especially vulnerable to COVID-19. And then Craig is going to end our talk really focusing on solitary confinement, which was overused as a mitigation tool during COVID, still is today, and really talk about some of his work locally around solitary in this state. Oh, I have the clicker. Okay, great. Okay. So here it is. We're going to talk about mass incarceration. Our group founded the COVID Prison Project, which is one of the only national aggregators of data in 53 prison systems across the country. So we've been documenting that. We've been taking down daily data from a number of systems for nearly 3 years now. We're going to tell you some of what we've found with some of those data and other projects that we have relevant to COVID. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Unlock the Box, solitary confinement in the state in general. So as many of you, as you may know, there has been a massive growth in the rate of mass incarceration in this country. And in fact, lots of people don't like the term mass incarceration. Instead, they prefer hyper-incarceration because incarceration does not impact all people the same. Communities of color are targeted by the police. They're incarcerated for longer. They tend to have more collateral consequences after incarceration and are more likely to become reincarcerated after release. And this has nothing to do with anything except for the system that really has been built in this country, traditions from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. Big changes in incarceration have happened over the years, though we've always had a higher rate of incarceration than almost any other country. You can see here that in the 70s and the 80s, we see a skyrocket change in the number of people who are incarcerated, and that's due to a number of things, but really the war on drugs. Research documents that Black people, white people use drugs at the same rate. A lot of studies actually show that white people use drugs more, but police tend to over-police in certain neighborhoods, right? So that's part of what we see here. We've seen the number of people who are incarcerated plateau a little bit, but still massively higher than any other country in the world. And it's important to also know where people are at. So we have prisons, we have jails, we have federal systems. We have about 1.2 million people who are in prisons, and those are places where people are incarcerated for longer. It tends to be a year or more. We have about 600,000 people who are in local jails at any given time in any given year. Important here, though, is that about 10 million people cycle through our jail system every single year. So about 600,000 people today, but if we looked at the length of a year, we would see a massive number of people churning through jails. The average length of stay is 72 hours, so it makes it really difficult to provide any kind of health care in these short stays where you have people cycling in and out. We also have federal systems that are all over the United States. And I mentioned this before, but it's really important here to focus on inequity in the system. You've probably maybe seen this. 1 in 3 Black men are likely to experience some form of the justice system in their lifetime, and that is much, much more than any other demographic. So, more people incarcerated in this country than any other country, much more disproportionate rates of the population, and that really has created 2 interconnected public health emergencies. You can see here COVID-19 on the right side of your screen, and also disproportionate, and that's for a number of reasons. So carceral spaces are places of risk for a number of reasons. First, people who are incarcerated tend to, on average, have at least 2 chronic conditions, which puts them at severe risk of suffering more severely from COVID-19, and we've seen that with the death rate being at least 3 times higher than the general population. Also, conditions are overcrowded, and so prisons before the pandemic were on average, over 100% capacity, which means that most prisons in this country had more people in them than they were designed to hold. Lots of people in crowded space is really just a perfect storm for transmission of COVID-19. And now I'm going to turn it over to Forrest Bene, who's going to talk to you about some of the data that we've been collecting.
Hey, everyone. And everybody can hear me okay? Great, thank you. So just as a quick aside before we get into what we have up on the screen here, you'll notice that throughout this presentation, we intentionally avoid words like inmate, felon, convict, offender. All of these are designed to intentionally dehumanize a population that is already marginalized. Instead, we try to use phrases like incarcerated people, prison or jail resident, or human first language, as borrowed from the disability rights movement, like person experiencing incarceration. This is very important, not just for the technical accuracy of the language, but to reflect the cultural context in which these terms are used. And this is something that I know. Part of the reason that I'm here is because I'm formerly incarcerated. And I was incarcerated during COVID. So in 2018, I went to prison for a crime that I did not commit. And I recall vividly the terror of the beginning of the pandemic. Nobody told us anything. We didn't know what was going on with our families. All that we heard was what we were able to capture on the local news at night. Food was cut down to 2 meals a day, friends, neighbors getting sick and dying. All of this is really important, and also a perspective that is important to represent in this research. Now, I'm extremely fortunate because I am, among other things, painfully white. I was pardoned and released in September of 2020. And a few short months later, I was fortunate to join Dr. Brinkley-Rubinstein in this COVID prison project. Now, I wasn't there for the beginning of this work, but it did directly benefit me. So I want to spare a moment to talk about how we arrived at what we're talking about today. So we've established that carceral environments and the people that live there are vitally important to understanding health equity and public health. But for researchers and observers, it is painfully difficult to try and obtain any data from these systems. So this is data from August of this year, the most current statistical publication from Alabama, just a snapshot from it. This is how they disaggregate race. Black, white, other. That's it. That's the best they can do. And then similarly with age, we'll see weird stratification like 18 to 27 and 28 to 37, and they don't map onto conventional methods of reporting data, making aggregation and analysis very challenging. Now, researchers can get more insightful information from statistical publications from the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics. And they have teams of PhDs and researchers that make comprehensive and very useful data sets. But it's presented at a years-long lag. So March of 2020, we get data from 2020. Oh, sorry, March of this year, we get data from 2020. Real-time analysis is not possible with that. But then March of 2020, overnight, we get departments of correction publishing what we have up here, Colorado's COVID dashboard from May of 2020. And we begin for the first time to see real-time health metrics from carceral populations. This is huge. It's not unproblematic, right? We're getting positivity rates, testing rates, mortality, but it is siloed by system. It's not aggregated at the federal level. You have to go to each Department of Correction individually to grab that info. But it's there. And some states, they will overwrite this data every day, so as to prevent historical records from being created. But this is where the COVID Prison Project comes in. So what this team did is a group of RAs, a whole team goes through and collects these data day by day, manually reviews and validates and cleans these data, and ultimately we were able to build a web scraper to perform a lot of these functions so that we can create this historical record day by day, oftentimes facility by facility across the US for COVID in prisons. And an important note here, we select prisons for a lot of the reasons that Dr. Brinkley-Rubinstein is talking about. The population is considerably more stable compared to jails, where high throughput, average stay is 72 hours. They're not collecting a lot of meaningful information. DOCs were really the only ones that were publishing this data that we could collect and then use. And what did we do with it? We made it publicly available to anybody that would benefit from seeing and using it. Free exportable data sets with everything that we had collected for use by journalists, policymakers, advocates, attorneys, researchers, family members. I know that my family saw this and benefited from it. So once we established a really robust system of capturing these data, we expanded the work that we could provide to respond to the needs of the community. So first, legal advocacy. We were able to furnish attorneys with data on, again, facilities that their incarcerated clients were trying to get out of because of medical vulnerability or because of overcrowding. We also provided data to nonprofit and advocacy organizations that were suing the government to allow people to get out of prison. And one of the most significant victories of that was the North Carolina arms of the NAACP, Disability Rights, and the ACLU were able to win the freedom of 3,500 vulnerable incarcerated people in North Carolina's prisons. We also participated in direct advocacy, that is to say, speaking with legislators and trying to enact real policy change. So we worked hard to try and get departments of correction prioritized in vaccine schema to say that, hey, these are vulnerable populations that you need to be giving vaccines to early. We also, throughout all of our messaging, try to encourage decarceration as a strategy for mitigating the pandemic's effects. Dr. Brinkley-Rubinstein also worked with Senator Warren on legislation that was aimed at improving data reporting for deaths that occurred in prison. And we also either testified or submitted testimony to a number of congressional committees. The Senate Judiciary Committee, looking at the failure of the Bureau of Prisons to accurately report mortality. The Senate Standing Committee on Investigations most recently about the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act, as well as the U.S. Commission on Human Rights? Human Rights, thank you. on Alabama's failure to adequately test their population. We partnered with the media and regularly advocated on behalf of incarcerated populations and tried to bring forward the data that we were collecting. And some of the most meaningful victories to me were times where we were able to leverage these media partnerships to create real change on the ground, like in Alaska, where they were housing known positive individuals with recent arrivals. We were able to talk with our partners at big name national outlet, I'll leave it at that. And they were able to contact the Department of Corrections and ask some probing questions that resulted in the change of how they structure housing. This is all in addition to conventional academic research, measuring community spread in and around prisons, trying to pin down a medically accurate definition of quarantine versus isolation, which was often mistaked by carceral agencies. We looked at labor policies for incarcerated individuals who, if you are not already familiar, are required to have a job. We looked at pandemic mitigation policies, what the agencies were doing to try and halt the spread of the virus and provide for the health and safety of those in their care, and notably where they failed to do that. And of course, we also looked at mortality. Who succumbed to the virus? Succumbed? We'll get there. To the virus in these facilities. And also, we were able to provide materials to members of the community and organizations that would help incarcerated people and their loved ones through fact sheets, partnering with grassroots organizations, and creating resource guides for those who had questions about what was happening to their loved one inside. So through all of this, we had to rely on a number of different non-traditional health research methodologies. And these included occupational safety and health administration. Thank you, I forgot that acronym. OSHA claims and adjudicated violations. Now, these are claims that are submitted by correctional officers claiming that their workplace was unsafe or hazardous to their health. And being able to find violations in the words of the officers. We also looked at social media to find, in some cases, rather blatant examples of carceral agencies that weren't adhering to their own rules. That's to say, overcrowding facilities, not wearing masks, any number of things. And all photographic evidence. It was really useful for us. And then also, we were especially benefited by using records requests. Freedom of Information Act for the federal government and its agencies, and the equivalent level sunshine or record law available in each state, primarily to obtain health outcome information, specifically mortality. And we also pursued non-traditional academic publications, where the three of us and one of our colleagues published this article in the Appeal, talking about the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act, wherein carceral agencies, police organizations, they have a legal obligation to report deaths that occur among individuals in their custody and care. And it often doesn't happen. A few weeks back, this was testimony that was cited, this was testimony that occurred at the Senate's Standing Committee on Investigations that cited this work. And now Congress is working to amend that law to create better systems of mortality reporting. So what did we learn through all of this? You know, I can show you where we are today. So this is all publicly available information that's on covidprisonproject.com that we collected through publicly available data from the Departments of Correction. And we can see an enormous burden of disease, and also nearly 3,000 people who died in prison. Dr. Brinkley-Rubinstein alluded to the 3 times rate of mortality, and also that incarcerated individuals contract COVID at a rate 5.5 times the population. If you take nothing else away from this, remember those, but also remember that these are likely underestimates. This is all fallible data. When we see those death numbers up there, New York Times reporting in 2021 was able to kind of peel back the curtain on what's referred to as deathbed releases. It's a practice in which when carceral agencies know that somebody is about to pass, they'll say, okay, hey, you're free, you served your debt, go. But just please don't die on our property. That way we'll have to report it, and that's a whole mess. And that happens more often than people think. So we're able to prove that these numbers are an underestimate. But this is at least what they say. And even those values represent enormous health inequities. The other big takeaway here is that prison walls designed to hold people in, but it does not prevent the virus or any communicable disease from entering or leaving. We're able to see, and research has proven out, that the rates of COVID in prison directly impact the rates of COVID in the community. And in this publication, they were able to show that nearly 16% of all COVID cases in the state of Illinois were attributable to the Cook County Jail, and that the single largest determinant, or predictor rather, of community spread was the degree of jail cycling, which you heard about earlier. It's how often people are introduced to a jail and then released from a jail. COVID in prison impacts communities. And also, the rate of COVID in the community directly contributes to rates of COVID in prison. And this is because every day, a department's worth of people will enter and exit a facility. Administrative staff, security, visitors, volunteers. And those are all opportunities for the virus to spread. So where do we go from here? There remain a number of important health questions that we're using these data to answer. So we don't yet know about long COVID in this population. People also got served less food and of less quality during this time. Don't know the effect of that. Same thing with prolonged social isolation. And during this time, visitors and volunteers, they just didn't come into prison. That wasn't allowed. So a lot of education and educational services, programming, rehabilitative support didn't exist. Don't yet know how that has impacted folks. And also, and I can attest to this one personally, there's no transitional support for people exiting incarceration during the pandemic. They handed me the balance of my account and said, good luck, hope you don't come back. And that was it. I'm fortunate to have a family that allowed me to stay with them and supported me through that time and that journey. Most people don't. And also, this cannot be understated, solitary confinement was used as a tool of mitigation. So, Vermont, for instance, first sign of COVID, they put as many people into solitary confinement as they could for long periods of time. My colleague, Dr. Craig Waleed, is going to talk about that, but it remains an important area for research. Pass it over to you. Thank you.
How y'all doing out there? Great to see you all. Yeah, my name is Dr. Craig Waleed, and I represent Unlock the Box movement. We are known as In Solitary Confinement, North Carolina. And our whole purpose is to end solitary confinement in the state of North Carolina. However, Unlock the Box is a movement that is spread across the nation. I believe right now there are 26 states who are involved in the efforts to end solitary confinement in their state's prisons. Some of the states have already been successful in having legislation or other policies passed that will limit the use of long-term solitary confinement. We're focusing on solitary confinement ultimately because it is a human rights violation. And when we think about solitary confinement and how it's been used to, in an effort to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in prisons, we see that it does more harm than good. As Forrest talked about with one of his last points, many people had been jammed inside solitary confinement as a way of trying to isolate folks from spreading COVID-19 within prisons. Just to give you a real quick background, right now my work is with Disability Rights North Carolina. We are a protection and advocacy agency that essentially fights for the rights of people who are incarcerated or people within our community overall who have disabilities. However, my particular work is with the criminal justice team, and so we are advocating for people who are incarcerated in prisons and jails. But the Unlock the Box movement, focusing on solitary confinement, is focused primarily on what's happening in prisons. So I'll talk a little bit about solitary confinement and how solitary confinement really is harmful to the individual, not just keeping someone locked up, but how it impacts people psychologically, emotionally, as well as physiologically. But first, let me just tell you just a little more, I guess, about what we're doing with Unlock the Box, and that is that we're using some grassroots efforts here in North Carolina. We're recruiting stakeholders from all parts of the city or all parts of the state to address the governor who had at one point been recommended by the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice to end long-term solitary confinement by utilizing or enacting the Mandela rules. Right now, we know that more than 2,500 to 3,000 people are in solitary confinement every day. International communities, scientific communities, academic communities are calling for the end of solitary confinement because of its detriment. What we want to see happen is the passage of the Mandela rules. The Mandela rules are United Nations recommendations for the fair treatment of people who are incarcerated, which calls for anything more than 15 days in solitary confinement as torture. So with the Mandela rules, we're looking at, or the Mandela rules call for people under 21 not be placed in solitary confinement, pregnant people not be placed in solitary confinement, people who have serious mental health disorders or disabilities or other substance abuse disorders not be placed in solitary confinement. There should not be indefinite periods of solitary confinement, because what happens sometimes is that people who have psychological disorders who are placed in solitary confinement, their conditions become worse, they become exacerbated, and sometimes folks who do not have psychological disorders, once placed in solitary confinement for extended periods of time, they develop psychological disorders. So again, the Mandela rules are calling for periods of no more than 15 consecutive days in solitary confinement, and that's what we're calling for as well with In Solitary NC via Unlock the Box movement. So just to tell you a little bit about solitary confinement, and this is not just from some research that I've done, it's also part of my own lived experience. I served 8 years in New York State's prisons from 1990 to 1997. I got off parole in 2001. While I was inside New York State's prisons, I did 2 30-day sentences in solitary confinement. I'll tell you, after maybe 2 weeks in solitary confinement without human contact, with fluorescent lights burning 24/7, without humane treatment, without decent food, though the food in prison oftentimes isn't that good anyway. But in some of the other things that happen in prison, the mistreatment from correctional officers, and a number of other things that happen in solitary confinement, I guess I would say it was the grace of God that I was able to hang on to my sanity. But solitary confinement, depending on what state you're in, it has different names. Some places call it the SHU, S-H-U, for a special housing unit, the box, the hole. But they give it all these names so as not to call it solitary confinement. People are in their cells 22 to 24 hours a day. As I just illustrated with my own experience, there's little or no human contact or stimulation. I talked to a gentleman yesterday about his own experience in the box in Florida, and he said that while he was in the box for 30 days or 60 days, he was only given a Bible and his underwear. No personal property, no books, nothing. And if you think about it, I shouldn't say if you think about it, because maybe you know, maybe you don't know. I'm assuming you know. But the size of a solitary confinement cell is about the size of maybe a parking space out here in the parking lot. Or it may be the size of a typical bathroom, say, in a small apartment. So just imagine if you spent your whole existence in there for 30 days, 60 days, a year, 10 years, 20 years. How do you think your psychological state would be? How do you think you would manage once you were released from there back into the general population or back into society after not having regular, consistent stimulation, things to help develop your mind? I don't think you'd fare well. So here's a picture of a solitary confinement cell. As you see, there's a toilet there. The toilet is open, unlike the toilet in your home that has a cover over it. You see there's a sink attached to the toilet. Many of the people that I've talked to, some of the things that I read in my own experience, makes me understand that oftentimes people equate the water with their toilet with the same water that's coming out of their sink. So it could be disgusting. As I mentioned about my own experience, the overhead lighting, it's always on. They may dim it in the evening, but they keep it on. The ideal is that we can see you, we can know what's going on. And then there may be a small window. Well, oftentimes people don't get access to natural light, air, fresh air, should I say, things that we take for granted. And then in certain high security cells, people never get out of their cells. Their shower is in the cell. And if they do come out of the cell for a shower, they get handcuffed. Sometimes they get shackled, depending on what kind of door is there. Then they get escorted to their shower. And sometimes they have to stay in solitary, in the shower with their handcuffs on. So we're talking about all of this because folks who were placed in isolation, placed in solitary confinement with the ideal of quarantining them because they have COVID-19 symptoms, they were facing these type of punitive and deteriorating conditions, conditions that will cause a deterioration of the human psyche, the human being. So this is what it might look like if someone were to be let out of there, or out of the, I wouldn't even call it there, because I don't want to give any ownership to the cell, to the person. They were let out of the cell to go to recreation. They would come out of the cell and be placed in a cage. This is an indoor cage. Sometimes they'll get allowed to go outside into a cage like this. Sometimes the cages look like dog kennels. Have any of you ever seen a dog kennel? Or you ever see a tiger or a lion in a kennel? There's not too much space for it to run, jump. It just kind of paces back and forth, right? That's what happens to the human being who's placed in solitary confinement, who's placed in isolation. They just kind of pace back and forth. So the humanity of the person is being stomped out. It's being mashed out. As I say that, I think about maybe a person who smokes a cigarette. When they're done with the cigarette, they'll throw it down and they'll mash it out, right? Mash out the cigarette, mash out the match or whatever, mash out the fire. Imagine the person inside of all of us, there's a fire burning. We want to live. We want to express ourselves. Yeah, maybe we've been incarcerated because we've done something bad. But that doesn't mean that we should continue to be punished while we're incarcerated. Incarceration is the punishment in and of itself. You hear me? So we need to treat people more humanely. If they've done something that is against societal norms that determines or demands punishment, face the punishment. But let's not continue to dehumanize people. If someone is sick with COVID-19, we shouldn't dehumanize them. There should be other mechanisms in place that helps them get better. But what we find is that in solitary confinement, there's an increased rate of all types of mental and physical health challenges. Also, after people get out of solitary confinement, there's an increased rate of disease, suicide, early death, et cetera, et cetera. Not to mention, most of the suicides that have happened here in North Carolina's prisons, they've happened while people have been in solitary confinement. So solitary confinement doesn't help anyone. All it does is it creates more of a problem for the individual, for the institution, and ultimately for our society when people get out. It becomes a public health issue. It becomes a public safety issue. So we have to treat people more humanely. So just a little bit more, I talked about how people who were placed in solitary confinement because they had COVID-19 symptoms. Oftentimes solitary confinement was really developed to discipline people, but it's also used to control people. But in today's climate in prisons, the worst of the worst are not the ones who are being placed in solitary confinement. People who are being placed in solitary confinement for infractions, not for being violent all the time. There may be a number of people who are in there for being violent, who are uncontrollable, but most people who are in there are placed in there for protective reasons or so-called protective reasons because of their sexual orientation, maybe because they were found with drugs, or maybe they were found with 3 pieces of bread, or too many books, or too many clothes, or just a bunch of arbitrary stuff. I almost used an expletive. So this is just some statistics about people who are there. They're disobeying a direct order. As I mentioned, substance abuse, substance possession, swearing, unauthorized use of tobaccos. But these people are not dangerous. They're not causing any harm. They're just breaking rules. So couldn't there be some other infractions or some other punishments, And a large percentage, or such a significant percentage of people who have psychological disabilities are placed in solitary confinement. Maybe because they don't understand, or maybe because they're having an episode, and so they get placed in solitary confinement. So the impact of solitary confinement, as I mentioned earlier, is that it exacerbates mental health issues that leads to mental health symptoms. Some people don't have it until they get there. Some people, they get worse. There's a wide consensus across the nation, across the world pretty much that solitary confinement doesn't do any good for anyone. And so in North Carolina, there was a study that found that people who spent time in solitary confinement were at what I call hyper-increased rate to die from suicide in the first year after release. More likely to die from homicide in the first year after release. And look there, 127% more likely to die of an opioid overdose in the first 2 weeks after release. And this is all off of the backs of solitary confinement. So my question is, why is solitary confinement used? If people are going to prison to be, I guess, rehabilitated, to pay their dues to society, but yet they come out in worse conditions most of the time than when they went in. So I'm asking everyone here to think about joining us in our fight to end solitary confinement in our state. And just to wrap it up, I'll just go through real quick. There's been an introduction of therapeutic housing units in prisons. So people can step down out of solitary confinement once their time in solitary confinement gets shorter, or there's less time, or they're showing improvement in behavior. They start stepping down, going into less intense, less secure situations where they can get some therapeutic intervention, therapeutic attention. But I think that's a little suspect. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but what's happening is that there's been some slow movement in the state that are starting to look at the impact, the psychological impact of solitary confinement on people who are there. But yet enough still has not been done. A big thing is that there has been a treatment mall at Central Prison that was established, can't remember the year, but people are starting to get some treatment. They have mental health task forces that help to improve the mental health of people in adult corrections here in North Carolina. So this is just a little slide about our therapeutic diversion units that I just talked about. The hope is that it helps to improve mental health diagnoses and problems, help people decrease self-harm and decreases infractions. I mentioned our step-down units, and the goal is to help people re-enter general population. And so that concludes. And again, I encourage you all to join us in our fight to end solitary confinement here in North Carolina by checking us out at disabilityrightsnorthcarolina.org or going online and checking out Unlock the Box campaign. The work that all of us are doing is vital to helping to restore humanity to a marginalized population. Thank you. Are we open for questions or?
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. This is plain. I keep hearing that decision to build more prisons is based on statistics that prisons receive from school systems regarding second and third graders' failing rate. I was wondering if either of you might comment on the veracity of that claim. And secondly, with regard to COVID, did your research explore the effect of misinformation on the carcinal population? were inmates willing to accept the vaccination without much concern for complications?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can take the second part. Our group did a lot of work trying to combat misinformation and to distribute vaccines in a number of jails and prisons across the country. We found that places in which educational campaigns were co-created really with people who were incarcerated, those were places where vaccine rates were pretty high. We saw that we have a lot of partnerships in Rhode Island, some places in the Northeast, and they did just that. So people who were incarcerated created fact sheets and then distributed those in the prison system there. And they had a vaccination rate of close to 80% of their incarcerated population. We saw that in other places, but when things like that didn't happen, we saw very low rates comparably. But misinformation certainly was an issue, but also, prisons are places where, as Craig really alluded to, people are dehumanized, and why would you trust that a correctional officer has your best interest at heart, right? And so there's good reason to be skeptical, and so that's why we found that when campaigns were created by people who were living in those places, who could talk to other people who are incarcerated, that's when those campaigns really fared the best. Yeah. I don't know, either of you want to talk about the sort of school to prison pipeline?
Well, I don't have any statistics on that. However, with my own experience of being incarcerated, one of the things that I did realize is there was a low number of people who had completed high school diplomas or equivalencies. And there has also been research that shows that the children of parents who are incarcerated have an increased likelihood of they themselves being incarcerated. Also, from what I've read and what I've studied, and please do your own research on this, it seems that children who are coming from some of the lowest performing schools across the nation are at increased rates of entering the criminal legal system. And so I think your question is heading in the right direction. And I think there may be some research out there to back it up and give you more detailed information. But I think you're right on point. But I don't think that there's more prisons being built in the country.
Yeah. And, I would, so the question was regarding a perception, something that I've heard too, about third grade test scores being the predictor that jurisdictions will use for how much occupancy they need to build out in prisons. I've heard the same thing. I can't speak myself to the veracity of it. But another thing to consider too is what folks term prison gerrymandering. There's a book called The Golden Gulag that explores the growth of prisons in California and how often they were placed in underserved and rural communities because prison population is counted towards the population in a jurisdiction. And if you have 2, 5, 10,000 people that suddenly are now in a rural area, that increases their congressional representation. So yes, test scores, I would imagine that is still something that is at play, but also congressional representation and the influence of private third-party prison contracts. So there's a lot there too.
And so I have a question, well, a couple questions actually. So I think when we talk about prisons, we usually think men in prison, but we know that women go to prison as well. Is there something different about their experiences in prison filtered through COVID-19 than men? And we know that all prisons are not the same. Federal penitentiaries and military prisons, how are they different in terms of managing COVID-19 within those prisons as well? And of course, as we speak today, we know in the early days of the COVID pandemic, things were very difficult. How have they changed since then to support the health and wellness of prisoners? Because you can't just get one vaccine today you got to get boosters, and these boosters have to be updated.
Yeah, I'll take that boosters question. It's a big question. So, we've been collecting all this data. Early days of the pandemic, 53 prison systems, all the states, Federal Bureau of Prisons, ICE detention, and also Puerto Rico. Every single one of those systems were giving us data on testing, on number of cases, on number of people that had died. And then when vaccines first came along, all those systems also were giving us what we thought was decent data on the number of people in their custody who had been vaccinated. We suspect that after that first vaccination push, vaccination efforts really fell off. We have almost no data on boosters, the first booster or the second booster, and data reporting has almost entirely stopped. So what we think happened in most systems across the country is that when that first push, people first became candidates for vaccination, prisons were, they were given vaccine, and they did give it to people and go around to dorms and offer it. And then I think after the first couple of months, that no longer is the case. I think if you are incarcerated, you ask for the vaccine, you can probably get it, but there are no active campaigns that I know of, and certainly no active campaigns that are going around trying to give boosters to people who have already been vaccinated. I imagine you two would probably agree with that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I love the question about the different types of carceral facilities, because it's part of what makes our work so difficult, because you've been in one institution, There are some things that are pervasive across systems, but really if you've been in one jail, you go to another jail, things may look and feel and operate very differently. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has thousands of prisons across the country, and they're all over in all the different states, and in many ways they go by whatever is happening in that state otherwise. There has been, as Forrest alluded to, some legislation that was introduced to try to understand what's happening in federal systems better, but that bill failed, unfortunately. So we really don't have a good sense of how it might look different, especially now. And when it comes to women, it's such a good question too, because I think a minority of people who are incarcerated are women, but the rate of incarceration for women has been growing rapidly over the years. Almost all of the prisons in this country were designed for men, right? And I think that I had a colleague who studies women's health in the context of incarceration, and she says that, women are considered little men, right? And that's like the extent of the consideration. When it comes to being able to stratify the impact of COVID, women who are incarcerated versus men, almost no states have given any demographic information. So it's been nearly impossible to look at the differences. I think we identified 4 states that were giving us any race stratification or gender or sex stratification, and they stopped doing that. So it's a really good question that is very difficult to answer.
Yeah. In terms of military prisons, you would think that in military prisons, COVID-19 vaccination would be mandatory.
Yeah.
That would create a different environment altogether, where you have 100% vaccination within a prison in any kind of sequestered population. So I think that would be different.
Yep.
In my business, we oftentimes need trusted messengers to help people understand what it takes to have the information they need to get a vaccine. And of course, what would be your trusted messengers in prison?
Yep.
And of course, are the prisoners incentivized to take vaccines?
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so absolutely, I think people who are incarcerated are trusted messengers in these contexts. In some cases, it might be medical staff, I think, you have a relationship with who has provided medical care for you in the past. That's really what we did in Rhode Island, is trusted messengers who are creating educational campaigns, talking to people about vaccination, their experience in vaccination. And as far as incentives go, there have been, many systems did give incentives for vaccination, and they really ran the gamut from what we saw in the general population, maybe a cash incentive, to things that we feel are fairly unethical, like early release. Yes, there were lots of different incentive campaigns that happened. Of course, they were very different across all the systems.
in solitary confinement, why do prisons continue to wear the name rehabilitation and correction? I know some states, they carry that name, Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. And why do they continue to wear that name if none of these things are happening when it comes to, rehabbing the individual and so forth? Thank you.
That's a great question. And it's one that I really don't know. And probably very few people know the answer to it. But I think it's definitely a misnomer, considering that a large percentage of people who are incarcerated, especially in state prisons, come from situations where maybe they have been deprived of many of social factors, that keeps them on the margin. So I'm saying that to say perhaps a large percentage of those people have never been habilitated to begin with. So how do we which means to do again, habilitate someone who has not yet been habilitated because they've been kept on the margins of society? So I think that what's important is that prisons work to help habilitate people, work to educate people, work to empower people, so that when they are released, they don't return to prison. When they are released, they don't cause further harm, hurt, or damage to their families and communities. But why they continue to use those terms, it's beyond me, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. So I do have two questions. The first one is, when we look at the prisons, do you see any racial differences in how they are all treated, how all the prisoners or the people there are treated? Are there any differences in terms of race? And secondly, I know you said it briefly, but what made you survive? And maybe a third one, for some of us having kids growing up, like basically I have boys, and I mean 4 black boys in America, and I worry about them every single day. What advice would you give a parent? Because seriously, I think about these things and I'm like, I'm protecting them like everything. But what advice would you give, especially in this society?
Great questions. I think both me and Forrest can probably speak to that. I'll take a first stab at it and help me remember some of what you asked, because I think you had 3 questions. One was, what helped me survive? And so I think part of that was my personal fortitude. But I think an even bigger part had to do with my community, my people in the community. As Forrest alluded to his own situation, having family, I had a good support network in the community that visited me, that accepted my phone calls, that sent me books, that sent me money so that I could buy foods from the commissary, things that just helped me stay stable. And so that helped me to develop a sense of hope. And the prison that I was in, the last prison that I was in before my release, had a college program that was funded from an outside consortium of 3 different colleges up in upstate New York. And engaging in that type of program helped me to develop strength, hope, strength and hope, I think, and have a better outlook for my possibilities coming out of prison. Another one of your questions were how to protect sons.
Yeah, before that, I asked about whether there were racial differences.
Right. And yeah, Dr. Rubinstein, Brinkley-Rubinstein talked about, how slavery and Jim Crow and all of these things, civil rights, restrictions, were all precursors or part of the whole prison dynamic. And so we know that the current state of prisons is an outgrowth of the black codes, where black life was criminalized to incarcerate black men, particularly to put them back out in the fields, to put them back in the coal mines or wherever they could get their labor. And as the 13th Amendment also alludes to, you know, slavery can still be practiced when someone has been duly convicted of a crime. And so slavery was meted out against black people, people of African descent in this country. So when we look at prisons today, there are more black people, more brown people in prison than there are white people or other people. As Forrest pointed, there's black, there's white, and there's other, whoever that is. You know, though the numbers of black and white people are very close, but there's still more black people in there.
And if I can add something to that, when we're talking about disciplinary procedures in prison itself, we still see a disproportionate representation of already marginalized individuals and communities of color in those disciplinary proceedings. So where Dr. Walid is talking about the offenses for which you can go to solitary confinement and how arbitrary they are, disobeying an order or being out of place or having one more of an item that you are supposed to be allotted, they criminalize all facets of life so that then those decisions to punish are almost entirely arbitrary. And what we find is that it is applied disproportionately by race. So that legacy that Dr. Walid is talking about still exists in the functioning of the prison today. And I'm gonna leave for you talking about your third question because white suburban kid, and also I'm not a parent. But in terms of how I survived, community, family, that's it. Making phone calls, answering emails,
Yeah,
a lot of reading.
yeah,
That's about it.
yeah. Common unity. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask if you all would make the references for your talk available. What the best way to do that would be. But I wanted to ask of the two gentlemen, if you could describe for us the run-up to your incarceration, like what was happening on the ground.
Just so I better understand the question, the run-up to my incarceration? Okay. Yeah, it's a story and perhaps more than we have time for, but what I can say from like a technical perspective is, so indicted 2016, again, I was able to be out on own recognizant bond. For 2 years, I was fighting the case, then went to prison. That pre-trial period is enormously stressful, and I don't think that often gets discussed as much as it should. I mean, I developed ulcers. It's terrible. And I had to go in for, to meet with my probation officer, sometimes 3 days a week. And I couldn't drive during that time, so that was a lot of cab fare money, a lot of time away from work. One of the things that I love about this lab is that Dr. Brinkley-Rubinstein talks about the creep of carceral logic and how these decisions of who, why, and how we punish affect everything. Affect all aspects of daily life, how people function, how people just navigate through the world. And while I only saw a sliver of it, it's brought me to this work, and I think that all of us are going to be here for a while. There's a lot of work left to do.
Absolutely, a whole lot of work to do. And to answer your question, what led up to my incarceration, I think there were multiple factors, but one is that I grew up in a single-parent home where I did not have regular supervision. I did not have someone regularly there to process with me a lot of the information that was coming into me, the negative information that I was receiving about what it meant to be a boy, what it meant to be a black boy growing into a black man. So I swallowed hook, line, and sinker all of the negative connotations, all the negative messages. And so I began to engage in heavy drug use, criminal activity, violence, hypersexuality, not to mention As a young child, I had been sexually assaulted, and so I was angry most of my teenage years. And so I figured anyone that I thought was slighting me or about to slight me, I would get them first. And so ultimately, I got someone while I was out on a drug and alcohol binge, and I committed a very violent act, and I was charged with attempted murder and assault. I was sentenced to 4 to 12 years in New York State's prisons. I did 8 years, 2/3 of my time, and then I did 4 years on parole. But you could read more about my experience in my book. I wrote a book called Prison to Promise, a chronicle of healing and transformation. It's available on Amazon, and you can also check out my podcast, Prison to Promise, where I interview formerly incarcerated people who are doing amazing things with their lives in the community.